December 1978. The wind from the far south does not blow. It lashes, dragging salt, ice, and a primitive sense of isolation that turns every rock in the Beagle Channel into an outpost at the end of the world. The grey waters seem motionless from afar, but beneath them stir treacherous currents that have swallowed ships for centuries. There, in that labyrinth of islands, channels, and dark mountains, Argentina and Chile were hours away from starting a war. In Buenos Aires, night fell heavily upon the official buildings. The lights burning in the military offices were not decorative. They were the signal that something irreversible was already in motion. On the maps, spread across long tables, the South was not landscape, it was an objective. Small red circles marked positions, advance routes, landing zones. The Picton, Nueva, and Lennox Islands were not remote names. They were key pieces in a strategic move that had to be executed with surgical precision. In that context, a phrase attributed to General Luciano Benjamin Menendez floated in the air like a brutal echo of confidence and arrogance. If they were allowed to attack, they would chase the Chileans all the way to the Pacific. More than a piece of bravado, it reflected the psychological climate dominating much of the Argentine high command. The conviction that the initiative had to be taken now, decisively, before the political stage could shift. The operation had its own name, Operation Soberanía. It was not a total war, at least not on paper. The objective was more calculated, colder. Strike fast, occupy the disputed islands, consolidate positions in a matter of hours, and then force a negotiation from a position of strength. Create a fait accompli before Washington, London, or Brasilia could react with sufficient diplomatic pressure. But the men planning all this knew that the word fast in the South was almost ironic. The terrain obeyed no calendars. The Austral Patagonia grants no free advantages. Every movement depended on the weather, the state of the sea, visibility, and coordination among forces that had never before executed an amphibious operation of that magnitude under real conditions. In the barracks of southern Argentina, the soldiers did not speak of geopolitics. They spoke of the cold that crept into their bones even before boarding. They spoke of the weight of soaked equipment, the smell of fuel mixed with salt spray, of the uncertainty that is never said aloud but is felt in the long stares, in the silences during dinner. Many came from the north or from the Pampa. The Austral landscape felt strange to them, almost hostile, as if the earth itself were warning that no one wins down there without paying a high price. Meanwhile, in distant offices, the Central Intelligence Agency was analyzing the situation with professional coldness. On December 11th, it had concluded that the chances of a peaceful solution were low. They did not view the conflict as a minor clash between neighbors. They saw the far south as a strategic hinge of the Western Hemisphere, a point where a war could alter maritime routes, naval balances, and Cold War tensions. In Argentina, the calculation was different. Time was not on its side. Strategic surprise had already been eroded by months of visible mobilizations, military exercises, and fiery speeches. Even so, the High Command accepted the risk. If the initial blow was forceful enough, Chile would have no margin to reorganize. That was the bet. 3 days, 72 hours to twist the chessboard. But beneath the surface of public confidence, there was a silent concern. Some internal reports warned that the Chilean soldier fought well in defense, that the terrain multiplied his effectiveness, and that the Argentine offensive would meet more friction than expected. It was not fear, exactly. It was the professional intuition that attacking always costs more blood than defending. The clock ticked on. In the south, ships were preparing to set sail. On the mainland, armored columns awaited orders. In the communication centers, Operators reviewed codes and frequencies again and again. No one spoke of defeat, no one planned for failure, but everyone understood that if the final order was given, the most inhospitable region of Latin America would be transformed into a battlefield, where the climate, the geography, and human will would decide the fate of thousands. Argentina was about to cross a line from which there would be no immediate return. And when a country decides to attack under the conviction that it must win in 3 days, every previous hour weighs as if it were already written in blood. In Buenos Aires, December brought no rest. The humid heat clung to shirts and turned the nights into something dense, almost electric. In the buildings where the military leadership operated, the windows remained lit long after midnight. It was not media exaggeration, nor a symbolic gesture. A decision was being made that could drag the country into an open war with Chile. The de facto government, headed by Jorge Rafael Videla, faced a dilemma that went beyond territorial pride. The 1977 British Arbitration Award had granted the disputed islands to Chile. And for the Argentine High Command, that was not simply an unfavorable resolution, it was a strategic threat. In their view, allowing Santiago to consolidate full sovereignty over the southern extreme meant accepting a maritime imbalance that could project itself onto the South Atlantic. The planning of Operation Soberania did not arise from an improvised impulse. For months, approach routes, amphibious capabilities, and international reaction times were studied. The maps of the Beagle Channel were marked with strokes of different colors, each representing a distinct phase of the advance. The islands had to fall first, then complementary positions in Tierra del Fuego and strategic sectors of Chilean Patagonia. Not to conquer the entire country, not to march on Santiago. The objective was more concrete and colder. Occupy, consolidate, negotiate. The plan demanded absolute speed. The first hours would be decisive. The Argentine forces had to land before dawn, secure beachheads, and neutralize any initial resistance. In the optimistic calculations, the islands would be under control within hours. The international community would take days to react with effective pressure. By then, the fait accompli would be in place. But speed had an implicit cost. In the planning rooms, it was assumed that there would be significant casualties. It was not discussed whether they would occur, but how many could be tolerated before the operation lost its political meaning. The problem was not only military, it was strategic. If the offensive extended beyond the first 72 hours, the scenario changed completely. The war would cease to be a limited action and become an open conflict with unforeseeable consequences. In the southern ports, preparation moved at another rhythm. The Navy's ships loaded men and equipment under low, cold skies, very different from the suffocating climate of Buenos Aires. The metal of the decks was wet. The smell of fuel mingled with that of the sea. The soldiers checked their weapons with mechanical, almost ritual movements. Some wrote brief letters that mentioned no destinations or dates. Others remained silent, leaning on the rail, looking at the dark line of the horizon as if trying to memorize it. The Argentine High Command trusted in its material superiority. During the previous 5 years, the country had received equipment and modernized part of its forces. In terms of numbers, the balance seemed to tilt in its favor. However, there was a variable impossible to ignore: the terrain. The far south is not a plain where mechanized mobility deploys all its potential. It is a tangle of mountains, dense forests, peat bogs, and channels that fragment any advance. Some officers recalled internal reports warning of Chilean defensive preparation. It was not an improvised force. The Chilean units had trained specifically for that environment, with emphasis on night combat and mountain warfare. Even so, the dominant logic in Buenos Aires was clear. Mass and strategic initiative had to prevail. At that point, the question was no longer whether a prolonged war could be won. The question was whether enough could be won in the first 3 days to keep the war from being prolonged. In the early morning before the final order, the military telephones rang with unusual frequency. Encrypted communications confirmed positions, estimated departure times, weather conditions. The machinery was in motion. There was no room for visible hesitation. Any doubt had to be resolved before the ships left port, because once they sailed, the return would no longer depend solely on Argentina. The night when everything was supposed to begin was not a calm one. In the south, the wind rose as if the very landscape wanted to intervene in the human decision. The gusts crossed the Beagle Channel with irregular violence, raising white crests that pounded the hulls of the Argentine ships as they awaited definitive orders. The decks vibrated under the sailors' steps. The interior red lights tinted the corridors with an almost spectral hue. The men were already on board. The deployment had advanced to a point where retreat was neither simple nor discreet. The amphibious units were ready to approach the disputed islands. The engines remained on, like restrained animals. Each passing minute increased the tension, not from explicit fear, but from the awareness that they were suspended on a historical threshold. In Buenos Aires, the situation was no less intense. In the command centers, officers reviewed weather reports that were not encouraging. Conditions in the far south were beginning to deteriorate rapidly. It was not just rain or strong wind. In an amphibious operation, the sea is an enemy as decisive as the armed adversary. A landing with excessive swell could disperse units, delay timing, and disrupt the entire sequence calculated to the minute. Operation Soberania was designed to be executed with almost surgical synchronization. Success depended on multiple pieces fitting together at exactly the right moment. The Navy securing initial control, the Army advancing at complementary points, the Air Force ready to cover or neutralize any counterattack. There was no wide margin for prolonged improvisation. However, the weather did not obey schedules. On the ships, the Argentine soldiers felt the rocking grow rougher. Some tried to sleep leaning against the cold steel. Others remained seated with their helmets between their hands, looking without seeing the metal floor. The smell of salt and fuel saturated their clothing. No one spoke of politics. No one debated the legality of the arbitration award. At that moment, the discussion was more basic. When would the hatch open? And who would be the first to step onto a hostile beach? The Argentine plan assumed Chilean resistance, but not Chilean improvisation. It was known that the enemy was alert. Months of mobilizations and public displays had eliminated any possibility of total surprise. That meant the first hours would not be a strategic stroll, but a direct clash against positions that were probably already prepared. At the same time, on the international stage, the signals began to multiply. The Central Intelligence Agency had warned that war was probable and that the first engagements would be bloody. Brazil watched with growing concern. The Vatican, with quiet but active diplomacy, was exploring channels to avoid open confrontation. In the Argentine decision room, the dilemma grew sharper as the night advanced. The weather report worsened. Visibility dropped. The operation could be executed, yes, but the tactical risk increased with every hour. A disorganized landing would not only cost more lives, it could turn a quick offensive into a prolonged battle from the very first day, exactly the scenario the plan was trying to avoid. And there emerged the question no one asked aloud, but everyone understood. If the offensive failed to achieve its objectives in the first 72 hours, what would happen next? Argentina had conceived the war as a brief blow to force negotiation. Chile, on the other hand, had structured its defense with the expectation of resisting and wearing down. If the first blow did not break that structure, the conflict would cease to be a limited operation and become an uncertain war on the most hostile terrain on the continent. Near midnight, communications between Buenos Aires and the south were constant. The naval commanders reported on the state of the sea. The land units confirmed position and availability. Everything was technically ready, but the final decision did not depend solely on technical preparation. It depended on accepting that once the offensive began, there would no longer be any way to fully control its evolution. In the dark waters of the Beagle, the Argentine ships waited. The wind battered the superstructures like a persistent warning. The men remained ready, aware that they were minutes away from leading the first major armed confrontation in the southern cone in decades. And at some point, between strategic calculation and the fury of the climate, war was so close it could almost be smelled in the salt air. Subscribe and keep discovering the stories that came close to changing the world. Midnight passed without the definitive word being spoken. On the Argentine ships deployed toward the south, time began to stretch like a taut cord. The engines kept vibrating beneath the decks, ready to advance toward the landing zones. But the final order did not come through. The naval commanders received constant updates from the mainland. The weather was worsening. The crosswind made any amphibious approach slower and more dangerous than expected. It was not fear that dominated the men who waited. It was uncertainty. The worst form of tension is not combat, but waiting for combat. Each soldier had already made his mental adjustment. He had accepted the possibility of not returning. Internally, the step had already been taken. All that was missing was for history to set itself in motion. In Buenos Aires, the dilemma had transformed into an urgent strategic discussion. Operation Soberanía was conceived as a quick, clean blow, but the meteorology introduced an element of friction that could alter the balance from the first minute. A disorganized landing meant immediate casualties, delays, lack of coordination among forces, and any delay eroded the central advantage of the plan: speed. At the same time, diplomatic signals began to filter through that complicated the scenario even more. International pressure was not yet public, but it existed. The possibility of a last-minute mediation began to circulate as a rumor that no one confirmed but everyone heard. At the highest levels of the Argentine command, the calculation ceased to be purely military. It became political. Because if Argentina attacked and managed to occupy the islands in the middle of a storm, paying an initial price higher than expected, the country would be committed to a conflict whose evolution could no longer be fully controlled. If instead it suspended the offensive at the last moment, the cost would be different. The perception of retreat, the public exposure of a massive mobilization without combat, internal erosion. In the south, the storm offered no respite. The sea pounded with irregular force, and communications suffered intermittent interference. The officers evaluated alternatives, but they knew that any improvisation under those conditions could fragment the force at the most critical moment. Meanwhile, on the other side of the channel, the Chilean positions remained on alert. No surprise was possible. The defenses were ready, deployed in depth, prepared to absorb the first impact. Argentina knew that the enemy was not sleeping. After a certain hour, the decision began to lean silently. There was no dramatic announcement nor fiery speech. The order simply was not transmitted. The offensive remained suspended. For the men aboard, the news arrived in a contained, almost bureaucratic form. Hold positions. Wait for new instructions. Do not advance. Relief and frustration mixed in proportions difficult to describe. Some felt they had been pulled back from the edge of an abyss. Others experienced a different kind of tension, that of having been ready to enter combat and having to return with that contained energy. The war did not begin that night, but the fact that it did not begin does not mean it was not on the verge of doing so. Argentina had mobilized forces, calculated casualties, and internally accepted the human cost of the operation. The country was hours away from executing a plan that, according to multiple international analyses, would have produced thousands of dead in the first few days. The storm, diplomatic pressure, and political calculation combined at the last moment to halt the machinery. However, what is truly disturbing is not that the war did not occur. It is to understand how close it was to being unleashed and what would have happened if that order had been pronounced just a few hours earlier. Let us imagine that the order had arrived, that at some point in that early morning in Buenos Aires, the indecision had been resolved with a brief phrase transmitted by encrypted channel, that the already warm engines had increased their revolutions, and the Argentine bows had oriented themselves without hesitation toward the designated beaches. The first lights of dawn in the Beagle Channel do not bring immediate clarity. The sky tends to open with a grayish gloom that barely separates the sea from the horizon. Beneath that opaque curtain, the Argentine amphibious units would have begun the final approach toward the disputed islands. The crosswind, the irregular swell, and the limited visibility would have turned every maneuver into an exercise in precision under pressure. The Argentine plan called for the rapid occupation of Picton, Nueva, and Lennox, not to ravage them, but to physically secure them before any international mediation could freeze the scenario. The logic was simple. Whoever was on the ground would have political advantage. But that strategic simplicity concealed a complex tactical reality. The beaches of the southern extreme are not wide stretches of soft sand, but rocky, irregular coasts with dense vegetation and abrupt slopes. A landing under adverse conditions fragments formations. The first sections to touch land would be exposed during seconds that could decide the fate of the operation. In that initial instant, numerical superiority loses part of its effect. What counts is coordination and the ability to reorganize under fire. Foreign analysts, including reports attributed to the Central Intelligence Agency and British evaluations, anticipated that those first minutes would be extremely costly, not because Argentina lacked professionalism, but because the defender, prepared and deployed in depth, would have the terrain in its favor. If the Chileans had distributed small units in dominating positions, as intelligence reports suggested, the first Argentine waves would have encountered immediate resistance from heights and natural cover. Not an open and symmetrical confrontation, but shots from difficult angles, crossfire in narrow spaces, advance through wet vegetation, where every meter is gained by real physical effort. And while that was happening on the islands, in complementary sectors of Tierra del Fuego and Chilean Patagonia, Argentine columns would have tried to fix and disrupt any counterattack. The objective was not an immediate deep penetration, but to prevent Chile from concentrating forces at a single point. The offensive had to be simultaneous to maintain the initiative. However, every fast operation has a silent enemy: time. Each delay in consolidating a beachhead amplifies the probability that the defense will stabilize. If an Argentine company needed additional hours to secure a perimeter, those hours were not neutral. They were an invitation for the adversary to reorganize its response. In Buenos Aires, the political and military leaders would have followed the development minute by minute. The first reports of casualties, inevitable in a landing under resistance, would have arrived as preliminary, still imprecise figures. At that moment, the initial conviction would be put to the test. To accept high losses during a very limited time in exchange for a clear, strategic outcome. Argentine offensive doctrine, influenced by French conceptions, assumed that the attacker pays a higher price. The calculation was not naive, it was conscious. But that price had to translate into visible progress. If after several hours the advance was marginal, the equation would begin to change. On the Chilean side, the strategy did not aim at a spectacular victory in the first hours, but at resisting long enough for the offensive to lose its initial momentum. Each defensive position did not necessarily seek to survive, but to inflict the maximum possible damage before yielding ground. That logic turned the combat into an asymmetrical race. Argentina needed to advance. Chile needed to delay. In that hypothetical dawn, the South would have witnessed close-quarters combat, with irregular visibility under intermittent rain and gusts that diverted trajectories. There would have been no major decisive armored movements. There would have been men advancing among rocks and tree trunks, radios saturated with urgent communications, and officers trying to maintain cohesion amid the initial chaos. If by sunset of the first day the islands were not completely secured, the pressure on the Argentine command would multiply. The 72 hours would begin to feel like a visible clock over every decision. And then the question would no longer be whether the offensive could begin successfully. The question would be whether it could be sustained. If the first day did not end with absolute and clean control of the islands, the operation began to transform into something different from what Buenos Aires had planned. The second 24 hours would not be a repetition of the initial assault, but a test of physical and organizational endurance. The Argentine units that had managed to establish beachheads would have to expand perimeters under constant pressure. The terrain, far from facilitating a rapid advance, would force them to progress along narrow axes broken by slopes, peat bogs, and damp forests that absorbed sound and disoriented even those carrying detailed maps. Every meter gained would have a tangible cost. At that point, the problem would cease to be exclusively tactical. Logistics would begin to weigh like a slab. Reinforcing positions, evacuating the wounded, redistributing ammunition, and maintaining communications in an environment of unpredictable weather required millimetric coordination. The far south does not forgive miscalculations. A delay in supply is not an administrative inconvenience. It is an immediate vulnerability. The international reports of the time, including analyses from the Central Intelligence Agency and British circles, agreed on one point. Argentina depended critically on the initial impulse not being diluted. If the offensive lost momentum, the scenario would change structurally. Because while Argentina needed to advance with visible speed, Chile needed exactly the opposite. Every additional hour of resistance increased the probabilities that the conflict would cease to be a lightning operation and become a war of attrition. And a war of attrition in the south does not favor the attacker. For the Argentine troops, the second and third days would have meant increasingly fragmented combat. Not great pitched battles, but intermittent engagements, positions defended from heights, controlled withdrawals that forced the advance to restart again and again. The enemy would not need to completely defeat the Argentine forces. It would suffice to prevent them from consolidating total control within the planned time. In Buenos Aires, the political calculation would begin to tense. The first real casualty figures, no longer prior estimates but specific names and numbers, would impact the internal perception of the command. The theoretical acceptance of losses is very different when the reports arrive with specific details. Each casualty is a reminder that the margin of maneuver is shrinking. At the same time, international diplomatic pressure would increase rapidly. Brazil would observe with strategic concern. Europe and the United States would assess the risk of an escalation in the midst of the Cold War. The Vatican, which in actual history intervened as a mediator, would intensify contacts to force a pause. The longer the combat dragged on, the more difficult it would be for Argentina to sustain the narrative of a limited and controlled action. And there lies the core of the problem. The operation was designed to create a fait accompli before the world reacted. If the world began to react while the fighting had not yet produced clear consolidation, the strategic objective was eroded. The 72 hours were not a symbolic whim. They were the psychological and strategic threshold. If, when that deadline elapsed, the islands were firmly in Argentine hands with complementary positions secured, Buenos Aires could sit at the table negotiating from a tangible position of strength. If not, the country would be trapped in an open conflict on terrain that favored the defender. For the soldiers at the front, however, time was not measured in strategic hours, but in accumulated fatigue. The permanent cold, the constant humidity, and the weight of equipment began to wear down even the best trained. The human body subjected to continuous stress in adverse conditions loses precision, and in combat, the loss of precision translates into errors. By the third night, if the offensive had not managed to break the Chilean defensive structure, Argentina would face an uncomfortable reality. The war would no longer be an operation of rapid imposition, but a conflict whose outcome would depend on prolonged resistance, sustained logistics, and internal cohesion under growing international pressure. And in that scenario, the question that would have begun to be formulated in silence would not be whether Argentina could begin the war. It would be whether it could afford to continue it. If the war had passed beyond the first 72 hours, without a clear definition on land, the true arbiter of the conflict would have been the sea. In the southern extreme, the channels are not simple navigation routes. They are narrow, winding corridors flanked by abrupt coasts that limit maneuver and compress tactical space. There, a squadron cannot deploy as in open sea. Every turn is conditioned by geography. Each miscalculation can leave a ship exposed in a natural funnel, where surprise comes not from the enemy, but from the environment itself. For Argentina, the Navy was an essential component of Operation Soberanía. Without dominance, or at least functional control, of the Beagle Channel, any land consolidation would be at risk. The disembarked forces depended on the constant flow of reinforcements, ammunition, and medical evacuation. The sea was the logistical artery of the entire operation. But the sea was also the most unpredictable scenario. In international analyses prior to the conflict, both in British and American circles, including the Central Intelligence Agency, it was warned that a naval confrontation in those channels would be extremely dangerous for both sides. Not because of the size of the fleets, but because of the conditions. The loss of a single ship in cold and agitated waters does not only mean a tactical setback, it means hundreds of men fighting to survive within minutes. In naval combat, the speed of tragedy is brutal. A direct hit, an explosion in internal compartments, a fire out of control, and time is reduced to decisions made under smoke and alarms. In the southern channels, rescue is not immediate. The cold of the water cuts off breathing in seconds. Hypothermia does not grant prolonged second chances. If Argentina had lost a destroyer or a key transport in the first days, the effect would have been twofold. Tactically, the capacity to sustain the front would weaken. Strategically, the psychological impact would be profound. The narrative of a swift and controlled operation would be replaced by images of naval destruction in one of the most hostile environments on the continent. On the Chilean side, the logic was similar. A significant loss would also have affected its response capability. But the difference lay in the strategic objective. Chile did not need to project offensive power beyond its initial defensive positions. It needed to resist. If it managed to inflict an important naval blow that slowed Argentine resupply, the equation of time would begin to tilt. And time, as had already been seen, was the truly decisive factor. In Buenos Aires, every naval report would have been evaluated not only in military but in political terms. International public opinion would react quickly to naval combats in the far south. European chancelleries would press with greater intensity. Brazil would increase its strategic vigilance. The Vatican would accelerate its mediation efforts. A limited war would begin to acquire continental dimensions. At that point, Argentina would face the most complex dilemma of all: continue escalating to recover the initiative, or accept a negotiation under conditions less favorable than expected. The operation, conceived as a movement of rapid imposition, could end up transforming into a war of attrition that would drain resources, legitimacy, and internal cohesion. The disturbing thing about December 1978 is not only that both countries were prepared to fight. It is that the plans existed, the routes were drawn, the casualty estimates, although never officially published by Argentina, were assumed to be inevitable. It had been accepted that thousands could die within days if the offensive failed to achieve its immediate objective. The storm, diplomatic pressure, and political calculation stopped the machinery at the last instant. But during real, not metaphorical hours, Argentina and Chile were on the brink of turning the end of the world into a battlefield. And if those days teach anything, it is that wars do not begin only with gunfire. They begin when a nation decides it can control the consequences of the first move. If this episode helped you understand how close we came to a war that could have changed the history of the Southern Cone, subscribe and join us in the next analysis, because there are decisions that are made in silence and deserve to be told with all their depth.